All right, so we are continuing, and we are very happy to welcome Tamarind, Rossetti, and Stephen Wright that are running the Künstlerhaus Stuttgart. Thank you for coming. Thank you for already participating since the beginning, since yesterday, and going with us through all these thoughts and practices. Just to shortly introduce you both, artists Tamarind Rossetti and theorists Stephen Wright are usership coordinators, artistic directors of Künstlerhaus Stuttgart, where their artistic program, One Usership, Agriculture is the Future of Art, is based on an ecosystematic vision of human and other than human artistic and aesthetic agencies. This approach draws on their experience at a one-to-one scale agroecological test site in the Corrèze, growing organic produce, offering farm-to-table meals, and hosting farm-to-panel idea seeding workshops, all documented through art. As usership coordinators, they see their role as an opportunity to metabolize concepts, methods gleaned over the years from museology and permaculture into the art institution, creating space for usership in its broadest sense. Thank you so much for coming and participating in this. We appreciate this a lot, and I will give you the microphone.
Thank you, everyone. It's been a pleasure to hear all of the conversations and presentations already. We're going to start with a breathing exercise together, and as the other exercises have stated, you are invited to participate, but you don't have to. But we're going to start. One, in terms of the topic of the symposium, thinking about speculative institutions and how we can change for the better in times of crisis, I wanted to share an exercise that I use and sometimes share with my students, which is called segmented breathing. And maybe some of you are familiar with it. And then we'll just do that for about 30 seconds, maybe a little longer. And then after we're done doing that, we'll just do some deep breathing, just a long in and a long out for another minute, and then we'll begin talking and sharing images. So the segmented breathing is, instead of just breathing normal without thinking and letting your body do it, you think about breathing very small pieces, kind of like words in a sentence. And I suggest doing 8, but that might be a lot, so you could do 4 or 6, but you keep the same number each time you do it. So an example would be, so instead of breathing in and breathing out, you do 4 or 6 or 8 little tiny inhalations and then 1 out. So anyone who would like to try that with me, I'm going to do that for about 30 seconds. And then after that, we just return to aware, long inhale and long exhale, and then we go back to regular where we don't think about it and it just happens. Okay, let's begin for anyone who's interested in trying it. Okay. And now we can transition to long inhale and long exhale. Okay, thank you. We are going to share the ideas contained in our presentation, the speculative broadfork and the speculative brush, the idea jumping off of the speculative pen. These are two tools that we use, specifically the broadfork, which Stephen's going to talk about a little bit more in detail, as a tool in farming, a physical tool that you use with your body. Also the brush, which I love to use in terms of speculating ideas through images. So I am going to go through the images of how we like to calendar. So in terms of an institutional tool, I would like to share this with anyone who might like to try it. I like to paint what is coming up in the future, which may or may not come into being in the way that we envision it. But here is one painting of a broadfork, and then as we go through the presentation, I will share with you what we have in our office is walls of paintings which formulate our ideas as a calendar in a time sequence, but the time sequence is not necessarily in order. So, and as I go through those images, we will see what we had envisioned through the form of painting, which is very helpful for idea formulation for me and for us. And then I will share a number of images of what actually occurred at the Künstlerhaus and what's in those spaces. So we'll talk a little bit about the actual installations, but not about everyone. So at the end of the talk, if there's questions about specific images, we can go more deeply into that. And to begin, we're going to tell a little tiny bit about the farm, which led to the ideas that we're implementing at the Künstlerhaus.
I'd like to talk a little bit about the broadfork, which is the icon of the permacultural movement, or the natural farming movement, the movement as it's known for those who are involved in it. You know, the way in the art world we talk about the art world, even though there are a number of them and there's one hegemonic model and there's a number of others, but in organic farming and in permaculture and natural farming, it's the movement. But before that, I want to talk about the breathing exercise. Because I want to say what a fun and stimulating atmosphere you have created here yesterday and today. And when I say that, I mean it very sincerely, but I mean it metaphorically, is that we've created kind of an atmosphere. You've created an atmosphere. You've invited us to join in an atmosphere. And there's kind of an ambiance, a kind of an atmosphere, and that's a metaphorical use. But the breathing exercise wanted to touch not only on the metaphorical atmosphere, but particularly on the material atmosphere. Because in breathing, there is an exchange between the inside and the outside. It is the way our interiority is exteriorized, in the way we metabolize through our lungs the exteriority and make it our interiority, like a glove being pulled inside out, outside in. And in doing that together in this room over 2 days, there's not only an exchange of ideas, a discursive and conceptual exchange of vocabularies, ideas, there is a molecular exchange. The very fact that we have been breathing together, spending time together, means that there is a physical, material exchange between all of our bodies. We have become one another, we have become one. It's slightly uncomfortable in the sense that it's very legitimate to want to have our bodily integrity respected, but it's also a physical reality, a material reality, that we are in this process of exchange. We have become one, and probably the exchange is to such an extent after these hours of exchange that we will continue to be one another for the rest of the existence of our bodies. The millions of molecules of one another that we have internalized and externalized. So that is, in a way, something we learned from farming and something which we see as the essence of farming. You might say that breathing together is a way of farming the atmosphere. So when we come to what we do at the Künstlerhaus, we do not do exhibitions. We initiate and co-build atmospheres, but very much on the basis of that material exchange that I was referring to. Same thing with the Broadfork. And that's why we wanted to riff on this idea of the speculative pen. The Broadfork is a very, very old agricultural tool. In French, it's called the grelinette. It's kind of been reinvented recently, and someone actually has patented it, but it's something which has existed since, well, it's an ancestral invention. As you see in the picture, painted by Tamarind, it has 2 handles, and it has 5 tines. It works like this. You may have used it, but I'm just going to describe very quickly how it works. Is you place the tines on the soil, which is compacted. You step on them. They go into the earth to the level of the bar. Then you take one handle in each hand, and you pull back. If the soil is extremely compacted, it's a little bit hard, that first pullback, but it works. You push forward. Then you take the right handle, you pull this way. Then you push it forward. You take the left handle, you pull it this way. You push it forward, you pull it out, and you place it in again. It's a farmer-powered tool which is used in no-till farming, which allows the soil to be aerated without breaking the mycelium structure. If the soil is extremely compacted, for example, on pasture land, in regenerative farming, it is accepted that you till once. You till one time, and then in future years, you use the Broadfork to move through to break up the clumps. You can go quite quickly, about 1 meter per minute. So we were talking about slowness. Slowness is relative to fastness. That's slow compared to the speed of mechanized equipment, but it allows us to, it allowed us to, it's perhaps, let me put it this way, it's perhaps the scale on which human bodies were meant to ensure their nourishment and their food production. So slowness sometimes becomes a bit misunderstood in people who are new to permaculture. It kind of means slackerdom. But I can tell you that being a farmer requires hard work. So it doesn't require that you kill yourself doing it. In fact, you can't do that. But it does mean that you work to the level that your body is able. Yeah.
Let's see if this, I'm going to see if this works, actually. Do we have, no. Okay, let's go. Okay, so this is an image of the farm that we ran for a number of years in France, and we grew, the plan was to grow enough vegetables to feed 12 families. It was a scaled up version of the garden that we had before, to such an extent that it was a huge challenge for us, but also something that was a scale that we could imagine might be possible with a tutor, which we did have a tutor, and we started to learn the techniques, and you can see in the very back there, maybe the Broadfork and the squash and a number of other vegetables in the foreground. Here you can see also the farm tours that we did, and then we ended up transforming a lot of the vegetables that we made into farm-to-table meals, and there's a couple of examples there at the top.
So the farm-to-table project and the farm-to-panel project were integral parts of this because it was a one-to-one scale farm, so we actually were operating it at a full scale. We were selling vegetables. I think there's some images in the next slide of, perhaps not, that we sold, in the middle, the center image, it's maybe difficult to see, but it's, we would do CSA boxes, so seasonal vegetables, which we were selling, but we were in the Corrèze, which is an extremely rural part of France, where a lot of people have potager and grow their own vegetables, so it was not really economically viable for us to, and this is a very interesting question about what a permacultural proto-institution might be. It would have been very difficult for us to live from selling vegetables alone because we would have needed access to an urban market and we would have had to intensify production rather than extensifying it. And so we had a hybrid model. I kept my day job at the Art University, where I was directing a graduate research program, and was a farmer. Now that made both the graduate research program and the farm impossible, but it made them both possible in a certain respect. So it was a kind of a hybrid model, but we produced food for ourselves and for 12 families. That was the model, which we had analyzed would have been the traditional model for that plot of land, which was 2 hectares and included two commercial greenhouses and a barn, would have been the case like over the history. So we produced for 12 families, and I was working at that time in a university, just to give you an example, where I think we were 48 faculty. So what I calculated that, in fact, if I had 3 additional colleagues who had done the same thing as me, we would have achieved food sustainability in that workplace. And that was kind of the ecological model which we were trying to test drive, is what would make it feasible to do post-autonomous farming today. Because the crisis of autonomous art and the crisis of autonomous farming are born from a common historical moment and a common historical denominator, and their crisis, perhaps, and that's what we at least hypothesize in our sort of watchword, is that art, or that agriculture is the future of art, which is the future of agriculture. What did make it possible, however, and what worked quite well, was to transform the food and to do farm-to-table. And these farm-to-table dinners had a kind of gastronomical dimension, but they also had a kind of propagandistic dimension. They were the occasion where we would gather people together for a meal, where we could talk about these issues affecting biodiversity, affecting farming, and with an eye to art. I want to say, just maybe perhaps, I want to tell, I like anecdotes. Sometimes I have a bit of a tendency to go for theory, but theory is quite difficult for me, and I only really do theory because I think that important things deserve to have a kind of a strong conceptual framework, but I'm much more drawn to the fabulation and the fiction. But this is maybe fiction, but they're actually true stories. We had a neighbor, I say this because I want to touch on our definition of farming. We have a neighbor, he's an organic farmer. He doesn't do permaculture, he doesn't do natural farming, he does mechanized farming, but very successfully, very beautiful farm. Wouter van Meel, about a few miles from where we were in Dordogne in France. And he had lost a number of chickens to the foxes. And so the local hunters association were sure that he would see with a kind eye their plan to go out and hunt the foxes and eliminate them. So they engaged in a hunting campaign to kill these foxes. And he came out one morning and he stopped them. And they were very surprised because they thought, well, foxes, you know, what good are they? What good is a fox? And he explained that because they had reduced the fox population, they had in effect increased the gopher population. So gophers are these little animals like dormice that dig underneath the crops. And so they dig little channels, little tunnels, whole warrens of things. And in doing that, they don't do any particular damage straight away, but what they do is they create a situation where the plants will die because there is air underneath the root systems and they can't get the water, and so they wilt, unless you water them basically continuously. And so that's an anecdote, but it shows something, I think, which is key to thinking about natural farming and about, by extension, about a permacultural institution, is that there's a lot more farmers out there than we think. So that, according to the European Union, 4% of the population of Europe are involved in agriculture. But that's 4% of the human population of Europe. But if you think of all the gophers, and if you add to them all the foxes, and if you add to them all the microbacteria, and you add the ladybugs, and all the insects, and all the pollinators, and so on, that makes a very large collective farm. A lot of farmers out there. And that is a super important lesson well, in fact, it is the very basis of ecological thinking. It's the basis of thinking about expanded farming. So I often say that we have an unusually broad definition of farming. It's because we consider all of those who are making use, all those life forms who are making use of a territory in the process of living their lives to be, in essence, farmers. And a second anecdote, and then I give it back to Tamarind, is that one of the key books for us and for many other people involved in natural farming is a book by a Japanese agronomist by the name of Masanobu Fukuoka called The One Straw Revolution. And Fukuoka was trained as an agronomist in 1930s Japan and wasn't interested in getting involved in the war that Imperial Japan was embarked upon. And he had very unusual, for the day, very unorthodox ideas about farming, which he would later refer to as natural farming. No fancy permaculture terms for him. But he managed to convince his father, who was quite a wealthy orchard owner, to let him manage an orange orchard in one of the South Islands. And so he was super happy because this was going to be his chance to apply his radical theory and put it into practice of natural farming. So this was when he was a very young man. And his theory was pretty simple, is that you don't do anything. All this nonsense about pruning, all this nonsense about creating a distinction between culture, the essence of which is pruning and clipping and shaping and so on, to stress the trees, and not doing it, he thought that was just, don't do it. So basically his idea of managing the orchard was to not do anything, just to let it go. It was going to work, right? What could possibly go wrong? Well, he killed the entire place. Because this orange orchard had always been pruned. It had always been carefully manicured by human agency. And the fact of, so his theory, as he understood after having destroyed the orchard, was that he wasn't exactly wrong, it's just that he had applied it recklessly. So that, in reading that, not only did I understand something key to our farming practice to bear in mind, but also by extension, what a radical transformation or a permacultural transformation of an institution would be. To apply your theory directly and precipitously could be disastrous.
So then we ended up moving from the farm to a very urban center in Stuttgart to run a program, the artistic direction, which we called usership coordination, thinking about all of the farmers on the farm or all of the users of the space, like we were doing on the land, but actually in an arts institution. We had always used art in our practice, in farming and in teaching, and we thought it could be very interesting because we were doing both to be in a situation where we could invite others who were also working kind of in a hybrid way or with the similar topics or interests into the urban space of an art institution and see how we could work together and what would happen, specifically with the aim, like this symposium, of changing the actual working model within the institution, not just the topics that were presented. And this is how we approached our beginning and the 3 years that we have been there. So here is one of the first calendars with a number of projects. And here are 3 projects that we realized and what they turned out to be. One of them is that we started working with some winemakers, local winemakers, and I actually said I'm not going to go through every single project. So maybe you talk a little bit about the overview, and we can continue looking through.
One of the reasons why we started this, why we left the art world for a while and went to run a full-scale natural farming project as an art project was that I'd found myself using, maybe a bit like Annetta, I found myself using in front of my students metaphors like permaculture. And particularly I would be talking about perma-artistic practices, which was a kind of a derivation of that notion of permaculture. Perma-artistic practices are essentially what I also call one-to-one scale practices. In other words, practices which both are what they are and artistic propositions of what they are. So they don't have to be gigantic scale or even small scale or any particular scale. They just have to be the scale of what they are rather than being a representation of same. And so as we moved from a farm, which we ran as an art project, to an art project which we contrived to run as a farm, we chose to integrate these one-to-one scale projects. And on the upper left-hand corner, after having, in the previous slide, you see the speculative brush version of it. Then we invited some natural winemakers / artists, in other words, who produce naturally fermented wine as their art project, to start putting wine into the bottles. Along the same lines, in another slide, we invited kimchi maker and architect Paul Sullivan to run a series of fermentation and kimchi making workshops. Next slide, I guess.
Okay, I can share this. This is actually just an insert here. Olga 07 is a partnership that we have created in Stuttgart, and this also responds to the call that you had about the symposium as what is one thing that we could share with the group that would be a suggestion for speculating on how we can improve or make our own institutions more resilient. And one that we have found is this partnership with an architecture collective and project in Stuttgart that values art and artists in the community. So in their architectural project, they have 10 houses and also an art apartment. And in their architectural project, it actually has a space to house an artist. So this was unused and empty for a while because the human relationships were not they weren't nurtured, really. But then when we came, we found that this was an opportunity, and they allow an artist to stay in the apartment for a very, very, very low contribution. And so this allowed us to be able to invite Paul, who stayed with us for over 3 weeks, which we, in our budget of the institution, would never have been able to support. But because of the low fee, which is really only a very nominal fee, that he was able to actually live in Stuttgart for the time that he ran not only the kimchi workshops, but also started a kimchi cafe in our second floor gallery.
So this scale of projects, the one-to-one scale, the artistic propositions which both are what they are and propositions of what they are, has informed the programming. Now the programming at the beginning was based on what we referred to as one usership. And one usership comes from this idea from epidemiology as a concept which is known as One Health. So you've probably encountered it. It's not orthodox medicine, but it's one of the hypotheses out there is that there are not differentiated forms of health. There's not men's health, sexual health, mental health, different types of health, animal health. There is health, which by virtue of being alive, all life forms share. And we took that to the notion of who makes use of a Kunstverein, who makes use of the Künstlerhaus, which we came to run as a kind of farm. And it's a very differentiated and diversified group, of course, with many different interests and certainly many different visions of art and craft, incompatible visions. But one thing that they share, or that we share, is this fact that we are all making use. And to say that we make use, and in every language, as far as I know, this expression exists, and it's a very curious one, make use. So, in other words, use is not something which is given and immediately available. It's something has to be made. And whatever it whatever use is, and it's a strange thing because it's both production and consumption, and it's neither consumption nor production. It's something different. But whatever it is, it needs to be made. And the usership of the house was making it. We came into a Künstlerhaus which is 50 years old, approximately, almost, has some very interesting features. One of them is that, like an art school, it has, on the ground floor particularly, a number of workshops. So print workshops, ceramics workshops, photography workshops, very sophisticated machinery that people could not possibly have in their own spaces in most cases, but which are made available and which can be made use of. And as you move up to the galleries, second floor, there's art residencies on the third floor, and then on the top floor, more galleries. The further you move up, sort of the higher the conceptual art was typically being showcased. So that the most advanced, in some sense, form of institutional critique enjoyed the prestige of the fourth floor, whereas the arts and crafts were on the ground floor. So embedded in the physical architecture was kind of a conceptual architecture, which was very, very vertical and hierarchized. And this notion of one usership was an attempt to flatten that, and not only flatten it, but put it into a kind of a circular energy. Get the energies moving between these different places. And I think that, we'll move along with that. But one of the ways that we tried to do this was by saying, since we're showing practices on the one-to-one scale, perma-artistic practices, in other words, ones that do not depend necessarily on the existence of the artificial respirators of the mainstream art world in order to survive, but actually have found viability within the life world. Because we're showing those types of practices, it doesn't make any sense to create exhibitions. We need to tweak that term. So what we do might very well look like an exhibition at any one given time, but it's something which evolves over time. It's something which we refer to as atmospheres, just like that breathing exercise we did before. So we propose atmospheres which are not exclusively based on the hanging and the showing of discrete objects, but which are animated by a whole set of activities which allows their shape, and indeed it forces their shape to shift and transform over time.
And here are a couple more examples from the first year calendar, Grisdale Arts and Family Animation Screening and Uli Bernhardt. Three projects that we really wanted to incorporate. The Grisdale Arts collaboration, we wanted to incorporate 2024. We also talked about doing it in 2025. It actually has come into being this year and is in the Künstlerhaus right now. If anyone makes it to Stuttgart, you can come and print in the space. It is in the fourth floor, and on Wednesday night we had a community printing in the space, which also is an interesting and exciting change, a shift, which I think you have here at the temporary gallery, but actually making work in the space while there's work in the space being shown. And instead of thinking that you need to do that either before or in another location, that these things are simultaneous and in conversation with each other. And that was something that was really important to Adam and also to us when we were talking about this invitation. The family animation screenings were something that was very close to my heart because I am very excited about the possibility of bringing families and children into art spaces that are sometimes less welcoming and trying to shift that, which I know that you are also doing a lot here, and really appreciate that room that actually is a whole room dedicated. It appears. I haven't been able to see also all of the programming that you've done here, but we wanted to have arts animation, so artists who are doing animation, who are making films that are accessible to a lot of different ages, but to show that in the galleries, not just in a separate downstairs area. We actually do have a children's workshop at the Künstlerhaus, and it has a bit of a difficulty because it is in a side building. So we're still working on integrating that into the programming, and we have done some of that, but it is a challenge, like was presented in some of the other presentations, of education being separated and somehow in in opposition to the other programming or to the curatorial vision. So this is another attempt to integrate that. Uli Bernhardt is the original founder of the Künstlerhaus, who's an artist who is now in his 80s and who was the first artistic director of the Künstlerhaus. So this project was also something that we wanted to honor his legacy. We wanted to also integrate the older generation, the artists who are living and working in Stuttgart who are in their 80s. And how could we do that? And we were talking with him in 2024, and also that project took a while to get realized, but interestingly enough, one of his forms of art is poster making, and he did a lot of posters that became very well known in the German cultural scene and beyond. Yeah, and he now has some of his works also in the fourth floor along with the print show. So you can see he also gave an artist talk, and this is him on the lower right there, and the family animation screening, and you can see on the upper right in the print show that there is a wonderful variation in audience that we have been able to welcome in, who a number of people were part of the Künstlerhaus maybe in many decades before, or never were because of their young age and the inaccessibility of works being shown. Here's another envisioning, Earth Time, and here is the actual Jeremy Bolin and Brian Holmes, who worked on a project that actually has to do with the rivers and the soils that we connected with farming through the creation of soil, through the processes of the rivers. They have a project called the Anthropocene Commons, where the groups get together and talk about the possibilities for the future and how we have shifted and altered the earth. This specific project relates to the radioactivity within the soil that was measured by Jeremy and his film practice, his photography practice, and video making. This is a project called Voyage en Terre Amoureuse with Stephanie Sagot, and she is an artist working in south of France. She does a lot of envisioning of actual utopian communities that are happening, that are in process right now, specifically in France, but also a couple of others in Spain and other locations. But she also uses, somewhat like was shared earlier, this fabulating process within her art practice through image making. So some of the communities that she's documented through interviews, through painting, and through sometimes she shares the interviews through audio pieces. She also adds the possibility for what could be in these communities, shared communities of the future. She actually did a workshop, as you can see here in the bottom, with the Künstlerhaus team, where we did something kind of similar to the Exquisite Corpse, of imagining through this painting process, a shared painting process, of what would be the Terre Amoureuse, which would be the Künstlerhaus in the future. Okay, now here we are to the print shack.
So this is a project which was, the atmosphere began about 6 weeks ago with Adam Sutherland and Grisdale Arts. So this morning, Alistair Hudson mentioned that he began his work as a curator as the assistant director of Grisdale Arts. Grisdale Arts is a one-to-one scale farming project, agricultural project in the Lakes District of Northern England. There's a pub, there's all sorts of arts production, gardening and farming, and also quite linked to the to Coniston and to the Mechanics Institute and to the legacy of Ruskin. So that it was kind of embedded in or implicit in his discussion. But Adam Sutherland remains the director of that project, and one of his central interests is giving a different perspective on rurality. And what we chose to work on wasn't planned initially, but we decided to work with him on polemical posters over the past 2 centuries, but with a particular emphasis on rural printing. So William Morris, for example, well known in the arts and crafts movement and the useful art movement in England, had a shack very similar to this one in which he anonymously printed polemical and highly politicized posters and other documents. And so we decided to recreate that, not exactly, but in the spirit of a print shack as one might find it in rural areas. Even in comparatively recent times, in the upheavals here in Germany in the 60s and early 70s, a lot of the far left printing, simply for pragmatic and practical reasons, was done in barns far from rural centers where the law enforcement was less likely to come upon it. And so we, without any sort of claim to exhaustivity or surveying of political printing, we brought together a number of emblematic posters, not exclusively from rural settings, but largely, and then put the means of production or graphic production at the disposal of the usership of the house. So that could be anyone who comes in, but it's particularly, of course, those people who are close to the house and who are print enthusiasts and who were desirous in preparation for Pride, for example, which is coming up in Stuttgart towards the end of the month, to produce a certain amount of graphic material of the polemical nature and of a fun-spirited nature in an atmosphere of collectivity in that space. So that's a project which is ongoing. Polemical? Yeah, that's a term that Adam uses, I think, I shouldn't speak for him, but I do know him quite well. It's at once a word which he thinks will be rather produce a kind of discomfort in a certain type of desire for aesthetic stability, so that people will wonder just exactly what the fuck is going to be printed. But it's also a way of not saying political, which would perhaps skew it into a kind of a rather decidable kind of factor. So one of the things that has been, so the exhibition space is kind of a free-for-all. So you can put up a poster anywhere you want, you can stencil on the wall, and if you don't like what someone else has put there, you can simply poster over it or stencil over it. That's kind of his idea of a self-regulated public sphere. But since not everyone is exactly comfortable with that, and to ensure that no one is really comfortable with it, he wanted to produce a kind of radical undecidability. And I think this is the way that for this reason that he chose the notion of polemical. In a rural context, historically what polemical has been around the figure of Captain Swing. So Captain Swing is well known in the post-digger community in rurality as the people who called not to sabotage, because sabotage means you take your sabot and you throw it into the machine. That was initiated by the workers' movement in very urban Lyon in France in the 19th century. But in the rural context, it was to break the farm machines. So not necessarily to take your sabot and to throw it into the machine, but to perhaps take some of the either set fire or otherwise render unusable the farm machinery which belonged to the ownership or of the land and which was used for subservience of the people who worked the land. So very specifically, there's a number of posters that are polemical in that sense and are quite direct in calling for direct action against the landowners.
Okay, here are 3 more projects that we worked with, Contaminations with Catherine Ball, and she also did Plant Yourself, a dirt pile activation workshop, and also with Zhang Bo and the film installation and drawing installation, The Political Life of Plants. And I believe it's a little dark with the light right now, but on the top you can see a large dirt pile. In the city of Stuttgart, you see the large building behind, but also we were able to find some dirt in the city that people planted themselves in for a workshop. On the right, it's also a bit dark, but is a full wall scale film installation, which was one of our projects that brought the body into relationship with the soil. And the film installation was specifically about what is the experience of bodies in connection with contaminated ecological settings. So some of them were contaminated soil, some of them were old mines, some of them were different physical experiences of the ecological shift that we're going through right now. And it was one installation and one workshop to be able to see what was that like physically with the people that were invited to come into the space. We had also a school group come, and they were quite interested in the gymnastics of the thing. And so there was an amazing combination of gymnastic, enthusiastic energy of cartwheels and playing with these other dancers and movers in the film who were interacting with the ecological destruction that is all around us. So it was a wonderful installation. And on the lower left is Zheng Bo's installation of the political life of plants.
So Bo is quite well known, I think, in Germany, or at least in Berlin, for his films around ecosexuality, and we chose to show a different film, which is an ongoing research project called The Political Life of Plants, where he looks at the collective decision-making of vegetal life. So in other words, when a forest, let's say through climate change or reduced precipitation, increased precipitation, flooding, etc., a forest needs to decide to move elsewhere. But forests move at the pace of forests. They don't move at the pace of antelopes. All life forms have that's what I meant about slowness. It's relative. But he worked with scientists to try and get close to the idea of how decision-making is made in vegetal communities. Now, and he insists on the fact that not is there a political life of trees, but what is that political life like? This is very central to our program, because one of the things which I think is one of the key missions of the art of the coming decades is to acknowledge the artistic and of course the political, but also the aesthetic agency of non-humans. In other words, not to say, well, that art is the preserve of this one species, and not only the entire species, by the way, just a select, a particularly sensitive group of that species. That's what art is. It's the expression of their finest inner sensitivities or whatever. But to broaden that and to acknowledge the aesthetic function at work in all life forms, and to see, for example, in the leaves that change colors at the end of the summer, the yellows, the reds, to not see that as some kind of natural process that trees would probably love not to do, but they don't have any choice because that's how it works, but to see that actually that those colors are determined very specifically by aesthetic choices that are geared to what insects are available, what the temperatures are like. In other words, they are calculated to do something to attract something very specific to that vegetal life, and using aesthetic tools to do so. So we might talk about the cinema of trees in a very political sense. So to think, in other words, about art, and I think this is a place where smaller experimental institutions really have a role to play, is to think about art not from a human perspective, but from a planetary systems perspective. What is the role of art on Earth? And what would happen if art were removed? It's maybe hard to imagine what it does, because we're so sure that it does one thing, that we become blinded to what else it might be doing.
think I'll go a little more quickly through the very last ones because we're getting close to our time here. But at the beginning of this year, we had Anna Maona, who was in the studios at the Künstlerhaus, and they work on geopolymers, on inventing new soil by creating ground up pieces of leftover materials, specifically from building sites, but also materials that are usually considered waste, and to be able to reinvent a new way of creating. And this is their installation. And these are the materials in the forefront, if you can see, and they created kind of a natural history of new materials. And they also create paving stones, and they also have a one-to-one scale project that is called the Endless Garden, which is replacing the paving stones that are making the sidewalks in the city with paving stones that have some holes in the middle where plants can grow through. You can see those here. So this is actually a collaboration, I guess you could call it a collaboration, or at least an application with the city of Stuttgart. And a huge part of that project, of course, is the bureaucracy to be able to implement this. And it's in process right now. They also did a workshop where people could learn how to make their own geopolymers. And they did a rock crushing workshop where people would grind up the materials that they found at these waste sites. Or also, I don't know if anyone has been to Stuttgart, there's a large project that's been underway for 20 years to make a new train station, and it is still under construction. And so there's a lot of materials there to be ground up. And June and Freya, who are Anna Maona, they spent a lot of time working with this site.
Can I say one thing about, see that machine there? It's super cool. It's called a rock crusher, and what you do is you take architectural fragments, you take the city's built material, you put it in there, you crush it, you reduce it to powder, and you use that powder to build new rocks. So that is what I would call the destituent moment of eco-design.
Then we invited also Hanna Leah and Sofia Sadzakov to come and do a wine tasting and blending workshop. Now, Hanna worked with another partner on the winery 2 years earlier, and now she has a new partner on the winery, and so we invited them to come back to do a tasting blending workshop, which is what usually people don't think of as soil care, but we were relating this to the soil, and specifically the artist talked about in the workshop, when you taste different flavors or could be delicious or very repulsive, all of across the board, smells and tastes in the wine that you can sense through your own ability what needs to happen. There's something that needs to happen in the soil to make the growing work. So that relates to the farming, it relates to the vines, it relates to the soil, and the workshop was actually to be able to connect those things together. And here's a picture of their cave and the tasting. There's a lot more projects. I'm actually not going to talk about them. I'm just going to go really quickly through the images, and then we can have some questions, and maybe you want to say one last thing.
I'll just say one last thing. There's one last word that I wanted to mention, and that is the notion of metabolization. Because one of the imperatives that it's either stated or unstated, but one of the imperatives of public institutions in many countries, and including Germany, is that contemporary art needs to be mediated. So mediation is a requirement. And mediation, of course, has a very fraught history. The term was introduced by Hegel, also Stuttgart's finest son, around whom we did one of our earliest projects. We myceliated Hegel, we myceliated the Hegel library, and then harvested the mushrooms and ate them, thereby assimilating Hegel in a different way. But we like to say that we metabolized Hegel. And what we have done, or what we are endeavoring to do, and it's one of our most ambitious conceptual endeavors, is to replace the whole conceptual institution of mediation with something much more robust, much less idealist, much less metaphorical, and much more materialist, which is metabolization. And so the question that we really are asking ourselves is kind of double, is we wonder about the social metabolization of art and how that happens, how art is metabolized socially, by whom. And if you take the notion of metabolization seriously, it is metabolized, the process of metabolization does not end with the audience or the people or the spectatorship. It is, if it is metabolized by them, then it continues its process of metabolization throughout the social body. And inversely, the question is, what does art metabolize from our society? So what actually is metabolized in art? So this is not a question of mediation, which is ultimately premised on a horizon of truth, about telling what's really going on here in this artwork, but basically about how our bodies are ingesting this, which brings us back to a point, I think, of a slight divergence with Annetta, who in her fascinating article on what is a permacultural institution said, well, one thing for sure, it isn't about farming programming or agroecological programming. But in our case, and that's a very understandable point of view, and it need not be about that. But for us, it is both of those things. As you see, the programming has a strong agroecological component, which we took from the farm, but ultimately, we do agree with Annetta that it's not just about showing farm stuff and ecology projects, even though that does determine, to some extent, the atmosphere. It's about proposing these atmospheres where there is a kind of a collective metabolization of these practices on the one-to-one scale.
Thank you so much, Tamarind and Stephen. So many interesting, nice things. So speculative, Broadfork, the co-building of atmospheres, the social metabolization of art. Thank you so much. So now we have a few minutes to have a small conversation, comments, questions. Mm-hmm.
Maybe you could thank you for a very inspiring talk, and now I think we will have to organize a trip to Stuttgart to visit you and participate. We are also making kimchi in Cologne, you know, but maybe more privately, but also collectively. Sorry. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the art school. Yeah, actually, yeah, they have a kimchi. Yeah, we should have this kimchi internationale. Probably we have to format. But I wanted to ask you how, because I think it's a really wonderful proposal, and it's very radical in a sense. You know, it's very consequent, very thought through. How is your program perceived in Stuttgart? Like, what kind of reactions? Because it's very unique. It's very, you know, non-traditional understanding of the way the institution operates, and what kind of a reception you receive in Stuttgart from visitors, from other art institutions, from the city officials, politicians. How is it seen? Or do you have to do a lot of? Do you have to ask them to metabolize, you know, what you are doing, or do some elaborate, you know, explanations and so on? Like how does it work basically in Stuttgart now?
I can share a little and then you can. But the first thing that comes to my mind is that in the example here with Paul's Kimchi Cafe, we have so many people for the time that we have been at Stuttgart that come to us and say, I didn't step foot in the Künstlerhaus for 10 years because I wasn't welcome here. And then there's people that are going to their businesses, business people on their lunch break, and they come to the kimchi cafe and they don't really mind, is this art or is this not art? It's just a great place to be with other people that they have not been in community with before. And also the doors are now open and it's welcoming to a lot of different people from a lot of different parts of the community, not just the usual art going vernissage attending group that was the mainstay for a long time. So doing projects like the Kimchi Cafe, doing projects like the scything workshop, or doing projects like the family animation screenings, there's so many people who have shared that they're so happy that there's something for them there now. In terms of actually being received by the other arts communities, we've made really wonderful partnerships and collaborations with a lot of other arts institutions and residency. The Schloss Solitude residency program has been very excited, participatory, collaborative. We have a lot of people that are from the art school, professors and students and people who work in the workshops who are really excited about these new directions. That said, we have applied for so many grants that I cannot tell you, and we have shared these new concepts and this new terminology in these grant applications, and we do not know if it's because of the programming, or if it's because of the language, or if it's because of the ideas, or if it's just a really limited and competitive field that even if we would say something different, that these would be supported by the funding entities. But I would say that most of the funding that we have received is more core funding, and so it's not dependent on the programming, so there is much more freedom to be able to experiment within that, but a much lower level of budget to work within. And so therefore these partnerships that we have been able to build, like the one with the architectural project that actually makes accommodation possible for us to invite artists for longer periods of time, is essential.
Well, and we're also very grateful to the city government and to the team at the leaders at the Künstlerhaus for taking a risk on our proposal. It was by no means a foregone conclusion, and we didn't, quite honestly, when we submitted it, it was probably quite fortunate that we didn't at all count on getting an interview, that we just put our proposal out exactly in the terms that we wanted to. And so we're very grateful for them giving us this opportunity and for the support of our team at the Künstlerhaus and the whole usership of the house for the support that we've enjoyed over the 2.5 years. That's for sure. I think where we can do better is not by putting water in our wine and not by watering down the concepts, but by being more didactic. I think we have shied away a little bit from the didactic, and we thought maybe it could sort of slide by in the relational, but actually terms like metabolization, like usership, like atmosphere, we have managed to introduce them into the conversation, but I'm not sure that they have been entirely metabolized, if you like. And I feel that we, in the months ahead, have some work to do to be more reassuring about why we want to use these terms. It's not some sort of, new speak that we're trying to impose, but we're actually trying to name something that, we're not trying to bring it into being through performative magic, by saying it and therefore it might happen, but actually that they are attempts to name what we're already doing using terminology imported from other fields. And so metabolization came from our work with scientists around what some scientists call the metabolic turn in life sciences and in human sciences, social sciences, like talking about the metabolic city, talking about like what is metabolized in the food chain and so on. And we've kind of imported it in a kind of a migration into the vocabulary of the art world, which sometimes is rather sophisticated, but actually is other times rather impoverished and relies on a lot of the terms inherited from the past century. So I think that I'm excited to actually get out my speculative pen in this case, and develop a special different rubric on our website as well, talking about these things, and also reach out through our Tuesday night series of meetings to do a session and maybe a collective wording session of some kind. So I think there's something we could learn from these days here that we can apply to something there.
So I understand that there were many grant applications that were not successful. Yes. And do you feel you have lost some visitors? Did you have people like complaining, like there was this, the reaction to Documenta 15, where is the art, as if artists were not experimenting with cooking and organic materials since at least the 60s. Yeah, there was this ephemeral artworks. There was, where is art? I don't know if you remember. Did you have this kind of a reaction, or some people stopped going to Künstlerhaus?
I think once in a while. We only have received actually a couple of people who actually spoke up and said that they didn't like the programming, but the people who also have been working at the Künstlerhaus much longer than we have said it's actually, that happens every time. For any kind of programming. There's always someone who doesn't like something. So it hasn't been, to our knowledge, more than usual. But we have received more than usual support because of all of these different groups who were not actually participating in the projects or in the installations or in the openings or in the workshops at the Künstlerhaus. And a number of people who do come to the workshops said that they didn't know that there were workshops actually, because it was very much of a closed circle. It was a lot more people who were either studying at art school or who already had knowledge of the workshops that are in the downstairs, that are actual, like the pottery wheel and the kiln and the lithography studio, these kinds of workshops, that they were not aware of them and so therefore weren't using them. And then also the workshops that the invited artists that we've worked with that have brought in have been, doing pottery in the gallery, doing kimchi in the gallery, doing printmaking in the galleries. And so these have brought many people who actually had never come before. So there's a whole other opening, and that seems very encouraging and very exciting, because with that there's a new energy and a new excitement, and it is something different, but it seems quite welcome. Like, so much so that a lot of workshops are too full to be able to accommodate. So then there's the funding question again. It's like, okay, so the people are saying that they really want to do this and they're really enjoying it. And the artists that we're working with are also very much enjoying it. But then how to sustain that and how to be able to support that in a budgetary way. Yeah.
It's actually something we also noticed, that our workshops are very often very quickly booked out. This is what our, community wants.
Yes, thank you so much for these inspiring examples. I have just a very basic question. The question rose before. It's a question of repetition. Is it? Are you enabled to repeat some workshops so that eventually it could become a practice?
This is interesting. This is maybe. We don't know. We actually have been able to invite a couple of artists. Specifically, we worked with Paul, and Paul brought his kimchi cafe, and it was so popular that we needed to add more workshops. And he is an artist who likes to do a lot of things. And so he was so excited to do more and more and more. This is not everyone's way of working. This is not a slow way of working. This is a super energetic way of working. So that was possible to be able, okay, so also with the Kimchi Cafe, we have wanted, since we came there, but also we heard through the grapevine that the artists and the workers at the Künstlerhaus had wanted a cafe for many years. And so when we actually implemented at a cafe as an art project and people loved it so much, we got so much feedback saying, can we just keep this here always? And of course, we want to, but the funding to run a restaurant is, or also the bureaucracy to get all the permitting, is very different than a temporary. And so the interest is there, the desire is there, but like what we were talking about throughout the weekend, throughout these days, is the structure, the long-term structure is not there to be able to sustain that at this point. But we have been able to do some repeats of one-day workshops or two-day workshops.
This question of workshopping, though, as form becomes something which is very interesting. And it's, when I began my career in the art world, 25 years ago, workshops existed, but they existed as some kind of a supplement to, let's say, the hegemonic exhibition form. And in this case, they actually have supplanted that. They have become full-fledged parts, components, the live programming component of the atmosphere. And they are understood spontaneously now as art propositions, full-fledged art propositions in their own right. And that's a different thing. And that's something which I think remains under-theorized, but actually is probably speaks to what Raymond Williams used to call the structure of sentiment of the contemporary moment. And that's something that we're quite interested in. Another thing which is, I think, quite linked to this is that a large sector of our usership / membership are very interested in craft. So Kunsthandwerk. And they organize spontaneously. This is not part of our artistic direction. The usership has a number of initiatives, any number, and so they organize regularly what they call the Haustreff. And they organized recently a Haustreff about the role of Kunsthandwerk today, generally. And they were very enthusiastic that we should participate in this, and so it took some time till we could find a date. But we understood it was very important, so I wrote a policy paper, if you call it that, a short paper called "Craft is the New Conceptualism," which is something that I believe, but which is something that they didn't know that I believed, and that they couldn't quite believe that I believed, because the hierarchy between conceptualism in its broadest sense, so the Fluxus spirit, concept art, post-concept art, in all institutional critique, in all its various forms, seemed to be a different art world altogether from the world of craft. And I think that I bring those two things up together because I think that this new ethos of workshopping as art practice and the increased role of craft within the ecosystem of our house, but within the ecosystem of the broader art world in general, really speaks to that. And so it elicited at once a certain amount of disbelief, but a certain amount of a kind of a wow factor, is like, wow, this guy who talks this weird talk, and he obviously comes from a whole different place. He really likes to get his hands into the clay and look at this print thing. The whole gallery is transformed into some sort of weird polemical print shop. So it did produce a kind of a great deal of interest and a desire for a second round of conversations on this topic. Ja, es ist sogar auf Deutsch. Naja, because this particular sector of our usership is much more comfortable in German. They're not the sort of internationalized, I mean, it's not that they don't speak English, I'm sure they do, but they are not accustomed to the art world discourse, which is largely, vernacularized in English.
I'm interested in these beautiful drawings you made, I guess, and it's part of a calendar, right? And maybe you can explain a bit more what this is, how this works. Is it yeah, it's so artistic, and I'm also interested in this combination of, yeah, like your curatorial work and your concept, of course, but also these small artistic interventions within, or how you would call it.
Yeah, thank you. That's why I wanted to share them, because usually they just hang out in our office. And basically it's my way of envisioning what we want to do, what we are hoping to do, what we would like to see happen. And like a lot of people have spoken about already, that usually we use writing to do that. And for me, maybe I need a little water. Yeah. For me, it is a moment of joy and silence and excitement to be able to reconnect with my own unknown, and something happens in that moment. And I do find that in the work, doing curation work and doing a lot of the administrative work that's required in this position, it's easy to lose touch with that. And so this calendaring, also I really love calendars. I've never known why, but maybe it has to do with time, or the absurdity of time, or the implementing of a structure on something that's completely abstract. I love it in images. It makes sense to me in images somehow, and it doesn't actually have to be linear, and that helps me to be able to remember, this is what we're doing, but we don't know if it's going to come into being. It's a little bit magical, but it's not like magical thinking where it needs to come into being. But it is pretty amazing to me that if you paint something or if you write something, that you are doing a speculative process, you're doing a fabulation of something that could be, and then to see what becomes, it is part of the process. This I like, and I wanted to share that with everyone here, because maybe you do your own kind of calendaring and it might be fun to try. Yeah. Thanks.
After speaking with you in preparation of today, it was the first thing that I told to the others, the calendar in the background. Super beautiful. I think when there's no... Megan. Right.
I think just going back to how you started a bit talking about the Broadfork, what is the curatorial equivalent? I mean, I know you proposed it as a tool, but how would you say you are Broadforking the Künstlerhaus? Like, what is the equivalent of like putting the tines in, putting your, weight on it, and then going a little bit this way? Because of course you've talked about it in extensive detail, but I'm having, apart from the slowness, of course, and the pace and the one-to-one scale, all of this that we have spoken about, what are you not disturbing in terms of the mycelium, like the depth that you're not touching? Like, does that mean something is being left unchanged? Does that mean it doesn't need to be changed? Yeah.
Thank you for that question. I'll do a quick answer. Because the first thing that comes to my mind is that I spoke with someone in the room already about this, that the post at the Künstlerhaus is based on an idea of cyclical artistic directorship. And so it's a post of 3 to 4 years. And so we had this idea when we began that this is a temporary experiment that we would be partaking in. And the idea, lots of times, of sort of a more old-fashioned, traditional curatorial premise would be to start from scratch, or start from a blank slate, or do everything different than was done before because there's this new program in mind, or this new exhibition in mind, or this new, right? So what we thought would be useful for us in this would be to go in, and one of our mentors when we started on the farm said, really the first year, what you need to do on a farm is you need to just watch how the mist settles on the hill, because then you will learn where the moisture is, and you will learn where the wind is, and you will learn where the sun hits in the afternoon. So in terms of working slowly, we wanted to do this, but since we only had 3 years, we didn't actually get to do this. But the idea was to do a little bit of that, to watch how the people move through the office, how they relate with each other, how they relate with us, what's the architecture, how do the people in the ceramics workshop relate to the idea of a new artistic director, or how does the person who does the finances work with the person who does the exhibition, installation. It's all of these kinds of, like what Stephen was just talking about the little beings, you know, the bugs or the foxes or the little, the ways in which the people, but also the other elements interact with each other in the space, and then how we, as somebody coming from outside in, are able to relate. What can we actually shift, and what do we not want to shift, or we have absolutely no intention or need to shift? So we had the idea, because it was brought to our attention before we started there, and we've both worked in other arts institutions before, that this hierarchical structure was something that was not welcome, and it was really embedded deeply, and it was not fun for people anymore. People that work there, people that came to visit, and people that actually wanted to install some new projects there. The artists maybe also weren't interested in being so separated or segregated like that. So I would say the structures that we did not change would be the architecture, because actually some artistic directors did do architectural projects that changed the actual structure of the building. We also did not change the architecture of the internet design, the website and all of that. And also when we arrived there was many people that came to us and said, do anything you want, but please do not redesign the website. Every single artistic director redesigns the website, and it's so expensive, and it takes so much time and so much resources. And it was just like, oh, it works, leave it. But we did actually shift a lot of things up. We did shift a lot of expectations in terms of what we were going to invite, who we were going to invite, and then how that was going to be activated in the space.
And I want to say it's quite a beautiful question, because it would require a more beautiful answer than I can give. So I'll give it more thought. But I did want to say that one thing that's about the Broadfork that's important to me is that it has two handles. One, that it's farmer powered, but that it has two handles. And I see those two handles as being the two sides of this permacultural institution, or perma-artistic practices embodied in an institution that's in becoming, is that on the one hand, you have to hold tightly to both handles. And one of them is that it's a material tool. It's not just the idea of a tool. It really is the tool. And a farmer and an artist are really very similar in the sense that using this tool, and that's why it's so interesting to compare it with a brush, is that it is a way of shaping a landscape. And so the way a painter would traditionally use a brush to change the way the light appears upon the canvas, and we're talking about very conventional painting, is there a very similar use of the scythe, and we did a scything workshop, or of the clippers, and we did a pruning workshop, or of the Broadfork, which you need to hold in its materiality on the one hand, but you have to keep your hand on its metaphoricity on the other hand. So it's important to always see it as a material tool, but also as a metaphor of a tool. Because I think if you lapsed entirely into, if you evacuated the material dimension, then I'm not sure that the whatever it was would continue to function as a proposition. And we're really interested in prefiguring something, because that's the thing that art can probably do best, at least at this historical moment. Not represent something, not redo something, but prefigure something.